The stark contrast between the glittering world of luxury and the cold, unforgiving reality of poverty could be summed up in the two people sitting at opposite ends of a polished, obsidian table. Elena Santos gripped her chair nervously, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her borrowed designer dress. She was sitting across from someone whose name the world knew too well, Adrian Kane, the tech billionaire whose disruptive AI ventures had made him both feared and admired. His sharp gray eyes scanned her, calculating and distant, as though she were just another variable in his well-coded universe. The terms had been simple, or so it seemed. Adrian needed a companion for a series of high-profile events to deflect rumors that he was cold, detached, and incapable of maintaining relationships. Elena needed a miracle. Her landlord was threatening eviction. Her younger brother's medical bills were mounting, and she hadn't eaten anything more substantial than instant noodles in days. "This arrangement," Adrian began, his voice cool and precise, "is mutually beneficial. You'll be compensated well, of course, and your obligations are minimal. You attend events with me, engage in light conversation, and appear invested." Elena tilted her head. "Appear invested? As in, pretend you're human?" His lips quirked in the faintest trace of a smile before it vanished. "Something like that." The first event came just 2 days later, an exclusive charity gala hosted in Adrian's honor. Elena had been whisked from her tiny apartment to a luxury salon where stylists worked tirelessly to transform her. When she finally saw herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her thick, dark hair had been tamed into an elegant chignon, and the emerald gown clung to her frame with a sophistication she had never dreamed of. Adrian met her at the base of the grand staircase leading to his private jet. "You clean up well," he said without a hint of emotion. "And you're just as charming as I imagined," she replied dryly, earning a fleeting glance of curiosity from him. The gala was a blur of opulence. Chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, the air hummed with classical music, and the elite mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. Adrian was the star of the evening, effortlessly navigating conversations with other tech titans, investors, and philanthropists. Elena, meanwhile, stood by his side, smiling and nodding when appropriate. But as the evening wore on, something began to shift. During dinner, an older man, Richard Crane, a titan of the real estate world, turned his attention to Elena. "And what about you, my dear?" he asked, his tone condescending. "How did you and Adrian meet? A businesswoman, perhaps? Or a fellow tech genius?" The table fell silent, all eyes on Elena. She felt Adrian stiffen slightly beside her, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if she should stick to the script Adrian had provided. A vague story about mutual friends, but something about Crane's smug smile, his tone dripping with superiority, stirred a defiance in her she couldn't suppress. "No, nothing like that," Elena said smoothly, setting down her fork. "I'm just a girl from the wrong side of town, trying to survive. Adrian hired me." The words hung in the air like a grenade, shocking and deliberate. Crane's expression faltered, and whispers rippled through the table. Adrian's hand tightened imperceptibly on his wine glass, though his face betrayed nothing. "You hired her?" Crane repeated, his brow furrowing. "Indeed," Elena continued, leaning forward slightly, her confidence building. "He hired me to remind you all that brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in a trust fund. That's what tonight's about, right? Giving back to the less fortunate. Well, here I am." The tension at the table was palpable. Crane's condescending smile faded entirely, replaced with discomfort. Adrian finally spoke, his tone calm but laced with steel. "Miss Santos has a unique perspective on the realities of life outside these walls," he said. "Something many of us could benefit from understanding." The table slowly returned to muted conversation, but Adrian didn't glance at Elena again for the rest of the evening. When they returned to his sprawling Manhattan penthouse, Adrian turned to Elena, his calm mask slipping just enough to reveal irritation. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice low. "What?" Elena shot back, slipping off her heels. You said I just needed to appear invested. I did. You went off script, Adrian said sharply, pacing the room. You made me look foolish. Elena crossed her arms, meeting his gaze evenly. I made you look human. You're welcome. Adrian stopped, staring at her. For the first time, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. The next day, Adrian's assistant informed Elena that she would be accompanying him to another event, a private dinner with potential investors for one of his newest projects. Elena was surprised. She had expected him to drop her after the previous night's performance. Are you sure about this? She asked as they drove to the venue. Adrian glanced at her. You've already disrupted my plans, he said coolly. You might as well finish the job. Elena raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The dinner took place at an exclusive restaurant where the waitstaff seemed to float silently between tables. The investors, 2 men and a woman, were all impeccably dressed, their expressions radiating wealth and power. As Adrian discussed the project, Elena observed him closely. He spoke with precision, laying out his vision for a new AI system that could revolutionize urban planning. The investors were clearly impressed, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. When the conversation turned to her, one of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Fields, asked, "And what do you think of Adrian's vision, Miss Santos?" Elena hesitated, aware of Adrian's piercing gaze. But once again, her instinct to speak honestly won out. "I think it's brilliant," she said. "But brilliance isn't enough if you don't understand the people you're trying to help. Adrian's technology could change lives, but only if he learns to see beyond the code." Margaret's eyebrows rose, intrigued. "And what do you mean by that?" Elena leaned forward. "Take urban planning, for example. It's not just about efficiency. It's about communities, families, people who are struggling every day just to make ends meet. If you don't include their voices in the process, all the AI in the world won't make a difference." The table fell silent, and for a moment, Elena worried she had overstepped again. But then Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "She's got a point," Margaret said, turning to Adrian. "Maybe you should consider including someone like Miss Santos in your team. Her perspective could be valuable." Adrian's expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm when he replied, "I'll take it under advisement." That night, as they rode back to the penthouse, Adrian finally broke the silence. "You have a way of making people listen," he said. Elena glanced at him, surprised. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," Adrian said. Elena smiled faintly, looking out the window at the city lights. "Maybe you should try listening sometime. You might learn something." For the first time, Adrian didn't have a retort. Elena Santos wasn't sure what surprised her more: Adrian Kane's uncharacteristic silence after her bold comments at dinner, or the fact that he hadn't fired her outright. If their agreement had taught her one thing, it was that Adrian valued control above all else. Yet here she was, deliberately challenging him in ways that no one else in his orbit seemed willing to. And for reasons she couldn't quite grasp, he kept her around. The days following the dinner were a whirlwind. Adrian had her accompany him to meetings, charity galas, and media interviews, her presence carefully calibrated to soften his reputation. While she expected to feel like a prop, something about the way Adrian observed her, intense and calculating, made her think otherwise. "Why me?" she asked one evening as they waited for a car to take them to yet another high-profile event. Adrian glanced up from his phone, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "Why you what? Why did you choose me for this arrangement?" He paused, his expression unreadable. "Because you were available." The words stung more than she expected, but Elena shrugged them off. "Right? Just another part of your algorithm." Adrian's lips twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "You don't fit the algorithm," he admitted. "That's precisely why you work." Before she could probe further, the car arrived, and the moment passed. The next event was a tech summit in San Francisco, where Adrian was scheduled to deliver the keynote speech. Elena was surprised when Adrian asked her to accompany him on stage, introducing her as someone with a unique perspective on the intersection of technology and human impact. The room was packed with industry leaders, journalists, and innovators, their attention riveted on Adrian as he outlined his vision for the future. When he gestured for Elena to speak, her heart raced, but she stepped forward with practiced composure. "Technology isn't just about innovation," she began, her voice steady. "It's about responsibility. We can build systems that change lives, but without understanding the people we're building for, we risk creating tools that serve no one." The applause was polite but curious, and as she sat back down, Adrian leaned in. "You have a way of simplifying the complex," he murmured. "I call it honesty," Elena whispered back. For a fleeting moment, Adrian's expression softened, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. After the summit, Adrian's behavior shifted. He became more reserved, spending hours locked in his office, immersed in projects he refused to discuss. Elena noticed the change, but she wasn't sure if it was because of her growing influence in his public persona or something deeper. One evening, she found herself wandering the vast, minimalist expanse of his penthouse. The walls were adorned with abstract art, the furniture sleek and uninviting. It was the kind of place that screamed success but offered no warmth. As she passed his office, she noticed the door ajar. Curious, she peeked inside. Adrian sat at his desk, staring intently at a photo. She couldn't see the image, but the rare vulnerability on his face stopped her in her tracks. Before she could retreat, he looked up, his expression hardening. "Do you need something?" he asked, his tone clipped. Elena hesitated. "No, you seem different lately." Adrian sighed, setting the photo face down on the desk. "I didn't realize you were monitoring my moods." "I wouldn't have to if you didn't act like a robot half the time," she shot back. He stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. "Good night, Elena." She left, but the image of him sitting alone, haunted by whatever lay in that photo, stayed with her. The next day, their dynamic took another unexpected turn. Adrian brought Elena to a casual investor lunch at a downtown restaurant. It was a smaller group, less formal than the events she was accustomed to, but no less high stakes. One of the investors, a brash venture capitalist named Victor Grant, zeroed in on Elena almost immediately. "So, Elena," Victor said with a sly grin, "you're the mystery woman Adrian's been keeping under wraps. What's your story?" Elena glanced at Adrian, who gave her a slight nod, permission to respond. "Not much to tell," she said with a small smile. "I grew up in a working-class neighborhood, did a little of everything to get by. Waitressing, retail, tutoring. Nothing as exciting as what Adrian does." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And now you're here. Must be quite the step up." Elena's smile tightened. "It's different, that's for sure." Victor chuckled. "Adrian, I have to hand it to you. You always find the most interesting assets." The insinuation made Elena's blood boil. She opened her mouth to respond, but Adrian beat her to it. "Careful, Victor," Adrian said, his voice deceptively calm. "Elena's more than capable of holding her own. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself." Victor laughed, though the tension in his expression was unmistakable. "Touché." After the lunch, Adrian turned to Elena as they exited the restaurant. "You handled yourself well. Is that what I'm doing here?" Elena asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "Handling myself?" Adrian paused, studying her. "What's really bothering you?" "You want honesty?" she said, stopping in her tracks. "Fine. I don't fit into your world, Adrian. I know that. But I'm not just some accessory you can trot out when it's convenient." His jaw tightened. "I never said you were." "No, but that's how it feels," Elena said, her voice softening. "You talk about innovation, about understanding people, but when it comes down to it, you're just as detached as the tech you build." Adrian stared at her, and for a moment, she thought she might have gone too far. But then he surprised her. "You're right," he said quietly. Elena blinked. "I am." He nodded, his gaze distant. I've spent so much time building systems and solving problems that I've forgotten what it means to actually connect. With people. With anything. The honesty in his words caught her off guard, and for the first time, she saw cracks in the armor Adrian had so carefully constructed. That evening, Adrian handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked, suspicious. "Your payment," he said. "For the arrangement." Elena frowned. "Are you ending it?" "No," Adrian said, his expression unreadable. "I just thought you might want some security." Elena hesitated before taking the envelope. "Thanks, I guess." As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Adrian Kane than met the eye, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, she wanted to know what it was. Elena woke early, the faint hum of the city filtering through the penthouse's massive windows. She had been living there for weeks now, yet the sprawling luxury still felt alien to her. Even though Adrian rarely made small talk, their encounters left her with more questions than answers. Why did he keep her here? Why her, specifically? And what was he hiding behind his meticulously curated exterior? She poured herself a cup of coffee, the soft scent filling the air, and wandered toward Adrian's office. The door was slightly ajar, and curiosity got the better of her. Stepping inside, she was struck by the stark simplicity of the space. It wasn't what she expected from a man worth billions. No awards, no family photos, just a sleek desk and an array of screens glowing with streams of data. But something on the desk caught her attention. A photograph she had glimpsed once before. She approached it cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she picked it up. The image was of a younger Adrian, standing next to a woman with striking blue eyes and an infectious smile. Before Elena could think, a voice cut through the air. "What are you doing in here?" She turned quickly to find Adrian standing in the doorway, his expression cold and unreadable. "I was looking for you," she said, placing the photo back on the desk. Adrian's gaze flicked to the photo, his jaw tightening. "That doesn't answer my question." Elena folded her arms. "You've been acting strange ever since that investor lunch. I thought maybe there was a reason for it." He stepped into the room, his posture stiff. "There's no reason, and I don't appreciate people going through my things." "I wasn't," Elena began, but she stopped herself. "Who is she?" Adrian froze, his expression darkening. For a moment, it seemed like he might dismiss her question, but then he sighed. "Her name was Emma." "Was?" "She passed away," Adrian said quietly. "Years ago." Elena's curiosity deepened, but she saw the tension in his face. She wanted to press for more, but something told her to let it go. For now. Later that evening, Adrian invited her to a high-profile charity dinner. The venue was a glittering spectacle, filled with New York's elite. Elena had grown used to these events, though the attention she garnered as Adrian's date was always unnerving. As they made their way through the crowd, a tall, broad-shouldered man intercepted them, his voice booming. "Adrian Kane, I was wondering when I'd see you." Adrian's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas, it's been a while." Thomas's gaze shifted to Elena, his smile widening. "And who is this?" "Elena Santos," she said, shaking his hand firmly. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize Adrian had taken such a hands-on approach to his social life. You must be special." Elena forced a smile, the veiled insult stinging. "I like to think so." Adrian cut in smoothly. "Thomas, if you'll excuse us, we have other guests to greet." As they walked away, Elena whispered, "Friendly guy." Adrian's expression darkened. "Stay away from him." "Why? What's his deal?" "He doesn't matter," Adrian said curtly. "Just trust me on this." But as the evening wore on, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas mattered far more than Adrian was letting on. The next day, while Adrian was at a meeting, Elena decided to dig deeper. She couldn't explain why she felt compelled to unravel the mysteries surrounding him, but something about his guarded demeanor, and the cracks she'd begun to see, pulled at her. She started with the photo. A quick reverse image search led her to an old article buried in the depths of the internet. The headline made her breath catch: Emma Grayson, tragedy strikes tech visionary's fiancé. Fiancé. Elena read on, her heart pounding. Emma had been Adrian's partner years ago, long before his meteoric rise. They had been engaged, building a life together, when Emma died in a car accident. The article was brief, offering few details, but it was clear the loss had been devastating. Adrian had thrown himself into his work afterward, and within a year, he launched the AI platform that made him a billionaire. Elena leaned back in her chair, the pieces falling into place. Adrian wasn't just detached, he was grieving, even if he refused to admit it. But there was more. A related article mentioned Emma's family, specifically her brother, Thomas. Elena, she jumped, slamming the laptop shut. Adrian stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Care to explain what you're doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I was researching," she admitted. "Researching what?" "Emma," she said softly. Adrian's face hardened, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out. But then he exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "What do you want to know?" he asked, surprising her. Elena hesitated. "Why don't you talk about her?" "Because it doesn't change anything," Adrian said flatly. "She's gone." "But she's not, is she?" Elena pressed. "She's everywhere, in the way you keep people at arm's length, the way you bury yourself in work. Even this arrangement. It's all to avoid dealing with what happened to her." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You think you understand me? You don't." "Then help me," Elena said. "Help me understand." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "Emma was the only person who ever saw me for who I really was," he said quietly. "Not the tech prodigy, not the billionaire, just me. When she died, I didn't just lose her. I lost myself." Elena's chest tightened at the raw pain in his voice. "But that's not all, is it?" she asked gently. "This has something to do with Thomas." Adrian's eyes darkened. "Thomas blames me for Emma's death. He always has." "Why?" Adrian looked away. "Because I was driving the night she died." The confession hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Elena didn't know what to say. Adrian, always so controlled, now looked like a man on the verge of breaking. "You were in the accident?" she asked softly. Adrian nodded. "We argued that night. She wanted me to slow down, literally and figuratively. I wouldn't listen. The car skidded on the rain-soaked road, and..." He trailed off, his voice breaking. Elena reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It wasn't your fault." Adrian pulled away, his walls going back up. "Try telling that to Thomas." That night, as Elena lay awake in the penthouse, she couldn't stop thinking about Adrian's confession. For all his brilliance and power, he was haunted by the same demons that had shaped her own life. Regret, loss, and a desperate need to feel in control. But as much as she wanted to help him, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Adrian wasn't telling her, and she was determined to find out what it was. Elena couldn't shake the image of Adrian's haunted expression when he spoke about Emma's death. For the first time, she saw the cracks beneath his carefully constructed armor. The pain, the guilt, the weight of a tragedy that had shaped him. But she also sensed that he was still holding something back, a truth too raw for even him to confront. And then there was Thomas. Adrian's warning to stay away from him only fueled her curiosity. Who was Thomas beyond his role as Emma's brother? Was he really the vindictive man Adrian claimed? Or was there more to their feud than Adrian let on? Elena decided to find out. A few days later, Elena attended yet another high-profile event as Adrian's date. It was a networking soiree hosted by a venture capital firm with ties to Adrian's latest project. As always, the room was a sea of designer suits and polished smiles, but Elena couldn't focus. Her attention was drawn to Thomas, standing near the bar and nursing a glass of scotch. Against Adrian's explicit warning, she approached him. "Thomas," she said, her voice even. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced with a knowing smirk. Elena Santos, the mysterious woman at Adrian's side. To what do I owe the pleasure? I wanted to talk, she said, stepping closer. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Does Adrian know you're here? He doesn't control me, Elena replied sharply. Thomas chuckled. Good for you. Most people in his orbit can't say the same. Elena hesitated, then said, He told me about Emma. The smirk faded from Thomas's face, replaced by something harder, angrier. Did he now? Let me guess, he made himself the victim. Poor Adrian Kane, the tortured genius who lost the love of his life. Elena frowned. He said you blame him for what happened. Blame? Thomas scoffed. Blame doesn't even begin to cover it. He killed her. Elena's breath caught. It was an accident. Thomas's eyes burned with fury. Was it? He's good at spinning stories, isn't he? But tell me this. Did he tell you what they were arguing about that night? Why Emma was so upset? Elena shook her head. Thomas leaned in, his voice low and venomous. She wanted to leave him. She realized too late that Adrian cared more about his precious work than her. That's what they were fighting about when he drove off in a rage. She was going to end it, and he couldn't handle it. The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She wanted to defend Adrian, to argue that Thomas's version of events was skewed by grief and anger. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, what if he's right? When Elena returned to the penthouse later that night, Adrian was waiting for her. You ignored my warning, he said, his voice sharp. Elena dropped her purse on the counter, her frustration boiling over. You don't get to warn me off people like I'm some puppet, Adrian. I'm part of this arrangement, remember? Or does that only matter when it's convenient for you? Adrian's jaw tightened. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Thomas? Thomas told me what you were arguing about that night, Elena interrupted. He said Emma was going to leave you. The words seemed to land like a physical blow. Adrian's expression darkened, and for a moment he said nothing. Finally he spoke, his voice low and strained. She said a lot of things that night. I wasn't listening. That's not an answer, Elena pressed. Adrian turned away, his shoulders stiff. Because it's none of your business. It is if you want me to keep pretending that this thing between us isn't completely insane. Elena shot back. You want me to play the part of the supportive girlfriend? Fine. But I'm not going to do it in the dark. Adrian spun around, his eyes blazing. Fine. You want the truth? She was leaving me. She said I was obsessed, that I cared more about my company than her. And she was right. Elena's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. She tried to make me stop the car, Adrian continued, his voice breaking. I didn't listen. I wanted to prove her wrong, to show her I was in control. And then, he trailed off, his hands clenching into fists. And then the accident happened, Elena finished softly. Adrian nodded, his gaze distant. Thomas never forgave me. I don't blame him. I haven't forgiven myself either. For the first time, Elena saw the depth of Adrian's guilt, the way it had consumed him. But even as she felt a pang of sympathy, she couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't add up. The following week, Elena's doubts deepened when she received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "The truth about Adrian Kane." Inside was a link to a folder containing police reports, witness statements, and news clippings from the night of the accident. As she read through the files, a chilling picture began to emerge. The reports confirmed that Emma and Adrian had been arguing, but there was more. Witnesses described Adrian driving recklessly, ignoring Emma's pleas to slow down. But what shocked Elena most was a detail buried in one of the statements. The driver appeared intoxicated. Elena's stomach turned. Adrian had never mentioned drinking that night. If the reports were accurate, his negligence wasn't just an accident, it was a choice. Confronting Adrian again felt impossible, but Elena couldn't keep the truth to herself. That evening, as they sat in silence over dinner, She finally spoke. "I know you were drinking the night of the accident," she said, her voice steady. Adrian froze, his fork hovering midair. "I found the reports," Elena continued. "The witness statements. You weren't just distracted, you were drunk." Adrian set his fork down slowly, his face a mask of restrained fury. "You've been digging into my past?" "I had to," Elena said. "You weren't going to tell me the truth." Adrian leaned back, his expression cold. "And now that you know, what are you going to do with it?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "But you can't keep running from it." "I'm not running," Adrian said tightly. "I'm surviving. There's a difference." Elena shook her head. "Surviving isn't enough, Adrian. Not if it means living like this, pushing everyone away, hiding from the world. Emma wouldn't have wanted this for you." Adrian's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't tell me what Emma would have wanted." "Then tell me," Elena challenged. "Tell me what you want. Because right now, it seems like you're just waiting for everything to fall apart." For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, finally, he stood and walked away, leaving Elena alone at the table. The tension between Adrian and Elena was palpable as they spent the following days avoiding each other in the vast expanse of the penthouse. Adrian buried himself in his work, retreating into the only thing he could control, while Elena grappled with the weight of what she had uncovered. Despite everything, a part of her couldn't walk away. She had seen the man behind the billionaire, the grief, the guilt, and the cracks in his armor. But the truth about that night and the rift with Thomas hung between them like an unspoken threat, and Elena knew they couldn't keep running from it. And then Thomas made his move. It happened during a critical investors' meeting at Adrian's tech headquarters. Elena had joined him, though their dynamic was strained. Adrian presented his ambitious plan for a new AI-powered system that promised to revolutionize urban planning. But just as he finished his pitch, the conference room doors swung open. Thomas strode in, his expression one of cold determination. Behind him trailed a journalist, a cameraman, and several shocked executives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced, his voice echoing in the room, "before you invest another dime in Adrian Kane, I think you should hear the truth about who he really is." The room erupted into chaos. Adrian's face darkened as he rose from his seat. "Thomas, this is not the time or the place." "It's exactly the time," Thomas snapped, glaring at his former brother-in-law. "For years, you've hidden behind your wealth and success, but the truth about Emma's death deserves to be heard." Thomas turned to the journalist, handing over a folder. "Here's everything you need. Police reports, witness statements, the whole story of how Adrian Kane drove drunk and killed my sister." Gasps rippled through the room. "Thomas, stop," Elena said, stepping forward. "Why?" Thomas shot back. "Because you've fallen for his act like everyone else? He doesn't deserve your pity, Elena. He deserves justice." Adrian's voice cut through the noise, steady but filled with a quiet rage. "I know you've spent years hating me, Thomas, and I don't blame you. But if this is about justice for Emma, dragging my name through the mud won't bring her back." "This isn't just about Emma," Thomas said bitterly. "It's about the world knowing who you really are. A man who hides his crimes behind a billion-dollar smile." Adrian met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no anger, only weariness. "You're right. I've been hiding, but not anymore." The room fell silent as Adrian stepped forward, turning to the journalist. "I was driving the night Emma died," he began, his voice steady despite the pain etched in his face. "We argued, and I was reckless. I made mistakes. Mistakes that cost me the woman I loved and nearly destroyed me." Thomas looked triumphant, but Adrian wasn't finished. "What Thomas won't tell you," Adrian continued, locking eyes with him, "is that Emma wasn't wearing her seatbelt. She unbuckled it to grab her bag from the back seat right before the crash." The room froze. Adrian turned to the journalist. "Check the police reports. It's in there. Thomas knows this, but he's always ignored it because blaming me was easier than accepting the truth. And maybe I deserve some of that blame. I was selfish, ambitious, and blind to what Emma needed. But I wasn't drunk. The toxicology report proves that, too. The journalist hesitated, flipping through the folder. He's right, she said finally, her voice neutral. The toxicology report shows no alcohol in his system. Thomas's face twisted with rage. You're lying. I'm not, Adrian said calmly, and I'm done letting you control the narrative. I've lived with guilt every day since that night, and nothing I do will ever bring Emma back. But I won't let you destroy everything I've built because of your anger. After the meeting, Adrian and Elena returned to the penthouse in silence. Once inside, Adrian poured himself a drink and sat by the window, staring out at the city. Why didn't you tell me the full story? Elena asked softly. Because it doesn't change anything, Adrian said, his voice heavy. Emma's gone, and no matter how it happened, I'll always feel responsible. Elena sat beside him, her expression conflicted. You need to forgive yourself, Adrian. For her. For you. He looked at her, his eyes raw with emotion. I don't know how. You start by letting people in, Elena said. You've spent so long shutting the world out, but you don't have to do it alone. For the first time, Adrian reached for her hand. I don't deserve your kindness, Elena. Not after everything. You don't get to decide that, she replied, her voice firm. But you do get to decide who you want to be now. Over the next few weeks, Adrian began to change. He met with Emma's family, including Thomas, and while their relationship remained strained, there was an unspoken truce between them. Adrian also made a public statement about the accident, taking accountability for his actions while clearing the air about the misinformation surrounding it. Elena stayed by his side through it all, offering support but never letting him slip back into his old habits. One evening, as they sat on the penthouse balcony, Adrian turned to her, his expression lighter than she had ever seen. I hired you to play a part, he said, but somewhere along the way, you became the only real thing in my life. Elena smiled, her eyes soft. I think you've always been real, Adrian. You just forgot how to show it. He leaned closer, his voice low. And you helped me remember. Epilogue months later, Adrian's company launched the Urban Planning AI system, integrating insights from community leaders and social advocates. An idea inspired by Elena, the project became a massive success, not just financially but in its impact on underserved neighborhoods. Elena, now a key advisor to Adrian's company, continued to carve her own path, never losing sight of her roots. Their relationship, while unconventional, grew into something neither of them had expected, grounded not in appearances or arrangements, but in trust, growth, and the shared understanding of what it meant to rebuild. And for the first time in years, Adrian Kane allowed himself to believe in second chances.